The moment my daughter laughed at my apartment, the entire room joined in. "Oh, Mom," Vanessa said with a smirk, holding her wine glass. "I still can't believe you live in that tiny little place. It's practically a storage unit." A few people chuckled. My son-in-law, Brandon, shook his head and added, "If I were you, I'd never tell anyone that address." I smiled and looked down at my hands. They thought they were mocking a poor old widow. They thought I was clinging to a small apartment because I had nowhere else to go. What my daughter didn't know was that the apartment she was laughing at sat inside a building that belonged entirely to me. And before this was over, she was about to learn a truth that would change everything between us. If this story touches you in any way, I'd love for you to stay with me until the end. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy heartfelt family stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your own child treated you this way? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd truly love to hear from you. I'm Pamela Hudson. And for most people who know me today, I'm just an elderly widow living alone in a small apartment on the north side of Chicago. That's all they see. A quiet woman with gray hair, sensible shoes, and a life that appears painfully ordinary. Every morning, I wake up around 6. I make a cup of coffee in the same white ceramic mug I've had for nearly 20 years. I sit beside the window and watch the city slowly come alive. Delivery trucks rumble down the street. Dog walkers pass beneath my building. Young professionals hurry toward the train station with coffee cups in their hands. And every morning, I think about Richard. My husband, my best friend, the man who had been gone for almost 8 years. People often assume that losing a spouse gets easier with time. It doesn't. You simply learn how to carry the weight. Some days it feels lighter. Some days it feels impossible. Our apartment wasn't large. Just a little over 600 square feet. The kitchen was tiny. The living room could barely fit a sofa and 2 chairs. The bathroom was outdated. The hardwood floors creaked when I walked across them. Vanessa hated it. She had hated it for years. To her, it represented failure, embarrassment, a reminder that her mother wasn't living the kind of lifestyle she thought I deserved. Or perhaps, more accurately, the kind of lifestyle she thought reflected well on her. I often wondered when that change happened. When my little girl started caring more about appearances than people. When she started measuring human worth by the size of a home, the brand of a car, or the balance in a bank account. Because that wasn't how I raised her. At least, I didn't think it was. When Vanessa was little, she had the biggest heart of anyone I knew. She used to bring home injured birds and beg me to help them. She once spent her entire birthday allowance buying blankets for an animal shelter. When she was 12, she insisted we spend Christmas morning delivering meals to elderly neighbors before opening our own gifts. That girl would have never laughed at someone's apartment. That girl would have never looked down on anyone, but somewhere along the way, something changed. Maybe it happened after college. Maybe it happened when she started climbing the corporate ladder. Maybe it happened when she met Brandon. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that each year, she became a little more distant a little more concerned with status, a little more focused on what other people thought. And eventually, those little changes became a completely different person. The first few years after Richard died were especially difficult. Vanessa called often then. She checked on me, visited me, brought groceries, sat with me during the holidays. I remember thinking how grateful I was to have such a caring daughter. Then her career exploded. She became a senior marketing executive for a luxury retail company. The promotions came quickly. The bonuses got bigger. The social circles changed. The conversations changed too. Suddenly, everything revolved around networking events, private clubs, vacation homes, investment portfolios, people she considered important. Every phone call became a summary of someone else's success. Someone else's salary, someone else's expensive lifestyle. And gradually, there was less room for family, less room for simple things, less room for me. One afternoon, about 3 years ago, she visited my apartment and stared around the room. I remember she looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Mom," she said carefully, "don't you ever think about moving somewhere nicer?" I smiled. "Nicer than what?" She glanced around. "This." I laughed softly. "I like this place." "You could have something better." "Better according to who?" She sighed. "According to everyone." That was the first time I realized we were speaking completely different languages. To Vanessa, success meant being admired. To me, success meant sleeping peacefully at night. To Vanessa, wealth meant displaying what you owned. To me, wealth meant not needing to. Those differences only grew larger over time. Still, despite everything, I loved her. A mother's heart doesn't stop loving simply because it gets hurt. Sometimes that's the tragedy of motherhood. You keep loving even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. A few days after the family gathering where she mocked my apartment, I sat in my living room looking through an old photo album. Richard smiled back at me from every page. There he was, holding baby Vanessa in the hospital. There he was teaching her how to ride a bicycle. There he was crying at her college graduation. There he was dancing with her at her wedding. I traced my fingers over one of the photographs. A picture taken when Vanessa was about 8 years old. She was sitting on Richard's shoulders, laughing, completely happy. Back then, she didn't care whether someone lived in a mansion or a studio apartment. Back then, she cared about kindness. I closed the album and stared out the window. The city skyline shimmered in the distance. Sometimes I wondered what Richard would think if he could see us now. Would he recognize the woman our daughter had become? Would he blame himself? Would he blame me? Or would he simply remind me that people lose their way sometimes? That pride has a way of blinding people. That life eventually teaches lessons no parent can teach. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Vanessa. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice sounded distracted, busy, rushed. "Mom, don't forget about the family dinner next weekend." Family dinner. The word sounded innocent enough, But lately, those gatherings felt less like family and more like performances. Places where everyone compared houses, careers, vacations, and achievements. Places where I never quite belonged anymore. "I'll be there," I said. "Good." There was a brief pause. Then she added something that made my chest tighten. "And maybe wear something a little nicer this time." I closed my eyes. Just for a second. Not because I was angry. Because I was tired. Tired of being judged. Tired of pretending her words didn't hurt. Tired of watching my daughter drift further away from the values that once made her beautiful. "I'll see what I can do," I said softly. We hung up. The apartment became quiet again. Outside. The city continued moving. Inside. I sat alone with my thoughts. What Vanessa didn't realize was that while she was worrying about appearances, I was beginning to notice something else. Something hidden beneath all the designer clothes and expensive dinners. Something she was trying very hard to conceal. And the more I paid attention, the more certain I became that my daughter's life wasn't nearly as perfect as she wanted everyone to believe. The following Saturday arrived faster than I wanted. Family dinners at Vanessa's house had become something I endured rather than enjoyed. Years ago, they had been warm gatherings filled with laughter, homemade food, and stories about everyday life. Now, they felt more like networking events disguised as family time. By 6 o'clock, I was standing outside Vanessa and Brandon's home in one of Chicago's most exclusive suburbs. The house was beautiful. 4 bedrooms, a 3-car garage, perfect landscaping, floor-to-ceiling windows. The kind of place that looked like it belonged in a luxury real estate magazine. Vanessa loved it. She loved what it represented even more. Status, success, prestige. I rang the bell. A few seconds later, Emily opened the door. Unlike her parents, Emily's smile was always genuine. "Grandma," she wrapped her arms around me before I could even step inside. At 16, she was nearly as tall as her mother, but she still hugged me the same way she had when she was 6. "Hi, sweetheart." "I've been waiting for you." She took my coat. "You look beautiful tonight." I laughed. "I think you're the only person here who believes that." Emily rolled her eyes. "Mom's already talking about somebody's new vacation house." "Of course she is." Emily lowered her voice. "Please stay close to me tonight." That simple sentence made my heart ache. Because I understood exactly what she meant. She knew these gatherings could be uncomfortable for me. And at 16 years old, she was already trying to protect her grandmother. Inside, the house was packed. At least 20 people filled the living room and dining area. Most were friends of Vanessa and Brandon. Successful professionals, business owners, executives, real estate investors, people who seemed to spend half their lives talking about money. As soon as I entered, Vanessa spotted me. "There you are." She kissed my cheek. The gesture looked affectionate. But I had learned long ago that appearances could be misleading. "You found the place okay?" I smiled politely. "I've been here dozens of times." A few people laughed. Vanessa forced a smile. Then she immediately turned back toward her guests. The conversation resumed exactly where it had left off. Someone was discussing stock investments. Someone else was talking about a luxury condo development downtown. Another couple was describing their upcoming trip to Tuscany. I sat quietly and listened. That had become my role, the silent observer. The older woman nobody paid much attention to, and sometimes being ignored allowed me to notice things other people missed. For example, Brandon seemed unusually tense. His smile appeared forced. He kept checking his phone. Every few minutes, he stepped away to answer messages. Vanessa wasn't much better. She laughed loudly, spoke confidently, played the role of successful executive perfectly. But underneath it all, I noticed small cracks, tiny signs of stress. The same signs Richard used to notice when employees at his company were struggling. People reveal far more than they realize. You simply have to pay attention. Dinner was served around 7. Everyone gathered around a massive dining table. The conversation quickly shifted toward careers. One guest had just received a promotion. Another had launched a consulting firm. A third was discussing a recent property acquisition. Then someone turned toward me. "So, Pamela, what do you do these days?" Before I could answer, Vanessa jumped in. "My mom's retired." The way she said it sounded strangely apologetic, as though retirement were something embarrassing. The guest smiled politely. "That must be nice." "It is," I said. "I finally have time for things that matter." The guest nodded. But Vanessa looked uncomfortable. I could almost hear what she wished I had said instead. Something impressive. Something that sounded important. Something worthy of her social circle. The conversation continued. Eventually, someone asked about real estate. One man had recently purchased several rental properties. Another was talking about rising property values throughout Chicago. I listened carefully. Real estate discussions always interested me. After all, property had shaped much of my life. Then Brandon leaned forward. "You know what's funny?" Everyone looked at him. "There are still people living in buildings they should have left 20 years ago." Several guests laughed. "What do you mean?" someone asked. Brandon smirked. "Old apartment buildings. Tiny units. Outdated everything." His eyes briefly flickered toward me, just long enough for me to understand the message. Several people followed his gaze. I smiled and took a sip of water. The table grew slightly awkward. But Brandon continued. "Some people get comfortable being comfortable." A few guests laughed politely. Vanessa smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not exactly, but not a protective one either. And that hurt more. Because she had a choice. She could have changed the subject. She could have defended me. She could have reminded everyone that kindness costs nothing. Instead, she remained silent. Emily noticed too. I saw her expression harden. She looked at her mother with obvious disappointment. After dinner, guests scattered throughout the house. Some moved to the patio. Others gathered near the fireplace. I found myself standing beside Emily in the kitchen. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "Of course, Grandma," I smiled. "You sound just like your grandfather." Her face softened. "I miss him." "So do I." For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Emily surprised me. "Mom wasn't always like this." I looked at her. No, Emily shook her head. When I was younger, she wasn't. The sadness in her voice was unmistakable. I don't know what happened. Neither did I, at least not completely. But I had theories. Success changes people. Not always, but sometimes, especially when self-worth becomes tied to other people's approval. Later that evening, while helping clear dishes, I accidentally overheard a conversation between Vanessa and Brandon. They were standing near the pantry. The door wasn't fully closed. Neither realized I was nearby. Did the bank call again? Vanessa asked. My attention sharpened instantly. Bank Brandon sighed. 3 times this week. That's ridiculous. No, what's ridiculous is how much we're paying every month. There was a long silence. Then Vanessa spoke again. We'll figure it out. We have to. His voice sounded strained. Very strained. The credit lines are getting tighter. My stomach tightened. Credit lines. Vanessa and Brandon had always projected financial perfection. Luxury cars. Expensive vacations. Designer clothes. Private schools. Everything looked flawless from the outside. Yet the conversation I was hearing suggested something very different. A few seconds later, Brandon lowered his voice even further. Maybe buying the lake house wasn't smart. Vanessa sighed heavily. We already own it. That single sentence explained more than they realized. Debt. Pressure. Financial strain. Suddenly, many things made sense. The forced smiles, the tension, the constant need to impress, the obsession with appearances. Sometimes, people judge others most harshly when they're secretly afraid themselves. I quietly stepped away before they noticed me. As I returned to the living room, a troubling realization settled over me. Vanessa wasn't merely becoming materialistic. She was building her entire identity around an image she could barely afford to maintain. And if that image ever cracked, everything beneath it might collapse. As the evening ended, I hugged Emily goodbye. Vanessa walked me to the door. Thanks for coming. Mom. Of course. She hesitated. Then she asked a strange question. Everything okay? I studied her face. For a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be. The one who cared about people more than appearances. The one who still existed somewhere underneath all this. That's an interesting question, I said softly. She frowned. What do you mean? I simply smiled. Nothing, sweetheart. But as I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd overheard. Because for the first time, I suspected my daughter's life wasn't just imperfect. It was fragile. And whether she realized it or not, I might already know more about her financial situation than she wanted anyone to know. The older I get, the more I realize that people only see the chapter you're living in. They rarely ask about the chapters that came before. When people looked at me, they saw a retired widow living in a modest apartment. They didn't see the decades of sacrifice, the risks, the sleepless nights, the years Richard and I spent building something together. A few days after the dinner at Vanessa's house, I found myself sitting in my living room with an old cardboard box resting on my lap. It was filled with photographs, receipts, letters, and documents that Richard had saved over the years. Pieces of a life most people knew nothing about. I opened the box and pulled out a faded photograph. Richard was 29. I was 26. We were standing in front of a rundown brick building with broken windows and peeling paint. We looked exhausted and completely happy. That building would change our lives. But at the time, nobody believed it, especially not our families. Back then, Richard worked as a maintenance engineer for a manufacturing company. The pay was decent, but not extraordinary. I worked part-time as a bookkeeper while raising Vanessa. We weren't poor, but we certainly weren't wealthy. Every dollar mattered. Every expense was carefully planned. Every purchase required discussion. We lived that way for years, saving, waiting, dreaming. Richard always believed in real estate, not because he wanted to become rich, because he believed property created stability. You can lose a job, he used to say. You can lose investments, but people will always need a place to live. I thought he was being overly cautious. Looking back, he was simply wise. One evening nearly 35 years ago, he came home carrying a folder. His eyes had that familiar look, the one that appeared whenever he became excited about an idea. "What is it?" I asked. "I found something." That sentence changed everything. Inside the folder were photographs of an aging apartment building, so the neighborhood wasn't desirable. Crime rates were higher than average. Businesses were leaving. Property values were low. Most people were moving away. In other words, it looked like a terrible investment, at least according to everyone else. "Richard," I said carefully, "this place looks awful." He smiled. "I know. Then why are you excited? Because everyone else sees what it is." He pointed at one of the photographs. "I see what it could become." That was Richard. While other people focused on present problems, he focused on future possibilities. The building wasn't large, nothing luxurious, nothing impressive. But it sat in a location that Richard believed would eventually develop. At the time, nobody agreed. Not the banks, not our friends, not our families, especially not our families. I still remember the dinner when we announced our decision. My brother nearly choked on his food. "You want to spend your savings on that building?" Richard nodded. My mother looked horrified. "That's your entire nest egg." "It isn't all of it," Richard replied. "Almost all of it." The criticism continued for weeks. People thought we were making a terrible mistake. Some even suggested Richard was having a midlife crisis. But eventually, we stopped explaining ourselves. And we bought the building. I won't pretend the early years were easy. They weren't. Not even close. The roof leaked. The plumbing constantly failed. Tenants complained. Repairs never ended. Every dollar we earned seemed to go directly back into the property. There were nights when Richard came home after midnight covered in dust and grease. There were weekends when we spent hours painting hallways ourselves because we couldn't afford contractors. There were months when I worried we had made the biggest mistake of our lives. But Richard never stopped believing, not once, and somehow his confidence became my confidence. Years passed. Slowly, things improved. The neighborhood began changing. New businesses appeared. Developers became interested. Property values increased. The buildings started generating steady income, then more income, then even more. Each year, Richard reinvested carefully. No flashy purchases, no expensive cars, no luxury vacations, just patience, discipline, and long-term thinking. Those qualities eventually transformed a struggling investment into something far more valuable than either of us had imagined. The funny thing is, our lifestyle barely changed. Even when we could afford more, we still lived modestly, still budgeted, still appreciated simple things. Richard often said something Vanessa used to laugh at when she was younger. Money is a tool, not a trophy. I don't think she understood those words then. I'm not sure she understands them now. As the years passed, our building became part of our identity, not because of the money. Because of the people, we knew our tenants. We attended their weddings, celebrated their graduations, mourned their losses. The building wasn't simply property. It was a community, a living collection of human stories. That's what Richard loved most. Then came the day everything changed. The day we learned he was sick. Even now, after 8 years, I struggled to think about it. The diagnosis arrived without warning. One doctor's appointment, one series of tests, one conversation that shattered our future. Cancer. Aggressive. Advanced. The months that followed passed in a blur. Hospitals. Treatments. Hope. Fear. Prayer. More fear. Through all of it, Richard remained remarkably calm, sometimes calmer than I was. One evening during his final year, we sat together in the apartment where I still live today. The same small apartment Vanessa would later mock. The same apartment that held some of the most important moments of my life. Richard sat near the window, watching the city lights. His health had declined significantly, but his mind remained sharp. "Pam," he said quietly, whenever he used that nickname. I knew he was about to say something important. "What is it?" He looked toward me. "When I'm gone, promise me something." Immediately, tears filled my eyes. "Don't talk like that. Promise me." I couldn't speak. I simply nodded. His voice remained steady. "Don't let money change who you are." "It won't." "I'm serious." "I know." He smiled gently. "People do strange things when wealth enters a family." I remember reaching for his hand. He squeezed mine. "Don't use money to control people." "I won't." "Don't use it to punish people." "I won't." Then he said something I never forgot. "If someone loses their way, let the truth teach them before money does." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Years later, I would, more than I ever wanted to. After Richard died, ownership of the building transferred entirely to me. Very few people knew. Most residents assumed a management company owned it. I preferred it that way. Privacy suited me. I hired professionals to handle daily operations. I remained involved behind the scenes, quietly, carefully, exactly how Richard would have wanted. Over the years, I considered telling Vanessa the truth many times, but something always stopped me. Partly because Richard valued humility, partly because I wanted my daughter to love me for who I was, not for what I owned, and perhaps partly because I feared what the knowledge might do to her. Looking back, maybe that fear wasn't completely irrational. As I sat in my apartment staring at Richard's photograph, I found myself thinking about his final words again. If someone loses their way, let the truth teach them before money does. At the time, I had no idea just how relevant those words were about to become. Because somewhere across Chicago, my daughter was making decisions that would soon force the truth into the open. And when that happened, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing a pattern. Once you know what to look for, it's difficult to ignore. Vanessa and Brandon were spending money at a pace that made no sense. At least, not for people who were supposedly under financial pressure. New designer furniture appeared in their home. Another luxury vehicle showed up in their driveway. Social media posts documented expensive dinners, charity galas, and weekend getaways. The image remained flawless. Perfect family. Perfect life. Perfect success. But I knew better now. Because behind every polished photograph was a reality they were desperately trying to hide. One Tuesday afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from Emily. She rarely called during school hours. "Grandma," her voice sounded nervous. Immediately, my instincts activated. "Emily, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." The hesitation told me otherwise. "What happened?" A long pause followed. Then she sighed. "My parents have been arguing a lot." I remained silent. Sometimes people continue talking if you give them space. And that's exactly what happened. They think I don't hear them. I looked out the window toward the city below. "But you do. Almost every night." My heart sank. Children always know more than adults think. They're stressed about money. There it was. Confirmation. Not that I needed it anymore. Still, hearing it from Emily hurt. Because children should not carry those burdens. "They'll figure it out," I said gently. "I hope so." Her voice became quieter. "I don't like who they're becoming." That statement lingered in my mind long after the call ended. Because it echoed something I had been feeling for years. Success had changed Vanessa, but financial pressure was changing her even more. And not for the better. 3 days later, something happened that pushed my concerns to an entirely different level. I was having lunch with Michael Reynolds. Michael had been our family attorney for more than 20 years. After Richard died, he became one of the few people who knew the full extent of my financial holdings. More importantly, he was one of the few people I trusted completely. We were discussing routine business matters when he slid a folder across the table. Something interesting came across my desk. I frowned. "What is it?" "Take a look." I opened the folder. The name on the paperwork immediately caught my attention. Brandon Carter. My stomach tightened. "What is this?" Michael leaned back. "A real estate inquiry." I continued reading. And with every page, my concern grew. The documents referenced one of the luxury penthouse units in my building. a unit that had recently become available. Brandon and Vanessa were apparently interested in purchasing it. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising were the financial details. Or rather, the lack of them. The numbers didn't add up, not even close. I looked up. They can't afford this. Michael nodded. That's my assessment too. The penthouse carried a price tag that would challenge even wealthy buyers, especially buyers already carrying significant debt. Yet, Brandon seemed determined to acquire it. Why? Michael smiled sadly. You already know the answer. Unfortunately, I did. Status, appearance, prestige. The penthouse represented all three. Owning it would place them among Chicago's elite, at least publicly. Privately, it might destroy them. I continued reviewing the paperwork. Then, another detail caught my eye. They think a corporation owns the building. Most people do. I shook my head. They have no idea? No. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Michael said something that made me uneasy. There's more. I looked up. What? He slid another document toward me. I scanned it quickly. Then a second time. Then a third. Because I couldn't quite believe what I was reading. Brandon had apparently been attempting to identify the building's ownership structure. Indirectly, quietly, discreetly, but intentionally. He wasn't just interested in purchasing a unit. He wanted leverage, connections, influence, possibly even special treatment. I felt disappointment settle heavily in my chest. Not anger. Disappointment. There's a difference. Anger is hot. Disappointment is cold. And far more painful. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment thinking about everything Michael had shown me. Outside, the city lights flickered against the darkness. Inside, memories flooded my mind. I remembered teaching Vanessa about honesty, about humility, about respecting people regardless of their circumstances. Where had those lessons gone? Had I failed somehow? Or had life simply taken her down a path neither Richard nor I could control? My thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. When I opened it, Thomas Bennett stood in the hallway. Thomas managed daily operations for the building. He'd worked with me for nearly 12 years. One of the best decisions I'd ever made. Evening, Pamela. Thomas. He smiled. Just wanted to update you. I invited him inside. A few minutes later, he was sitting across from me reviewing maintenance reports. Routine matters. Tenant requests. Repair schedules. Normal business. Then he casually mentioned something. Interesting call today. I looked up. What kind of call? He chuckled. A man asking questions about ownership. Immediately. I knew. Brandon. What did you tell him? The same thing I tell everyone. Thomas smiled. Nothing. I laughed despite myself. Good answer. Thomas closed the folder. Should I be concerned? I hesitated, then shook my head. Not yet. But privately, I wasn't so sure. Because Brandon wasn't acting like someone interested in simply buying a condo. He was acting like someone searching for an advantage. And people searching for shortcuts rarely stop after the first attempt. The following weekend provided even more confirmation. Vanessa invited me to brunch. At first, everything seemed normal. Emily joined us. The food was excellent. The conversation remained pleasant. Then Brandon arrived. And within 15 minutes, the topic shifted toward real estate. Again, always real estate. "I found the perfect penthouse," he announced. Vanessa immediately brightened. "The one we discussed." "Exactly." I kept eating, carefully, quietly, listening. Brandon continued. "The building is incredible." Vanessa nodded enthusiastically. "The location alone is worth it." Emily looked confused. "I thought you said money was tight." Silence. Beautiful. Uncomfortable silence. Children have a remarkable ability to ask the questions adults avoid. Brandon cleared his throat. "It's an investment." Emily frowned. "How is buying a penthouse an investment if you're worried about bills?" Vanessa quickly changed the subject. But the damage had already been done. The truth had entered the room, and nobody wanted to look directly at it. After brunch ended, I lingered near the front door while Vanessa walked me outside. As we stood beside her luxury SUV, she suddenly smiled. A strange smile, one filled with excitement. "Mom, I think we're about to move somewhere amazing." I studied her face. She genuinely believed this purchase would solve something, fix something, validate something. "I hope you're being careful," I said. Her smile faded slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means debt doesn't disappear because a view is beautiful." For a moment, she stared at me. Then she laughed. Not cruelly. Dismissively. The way people laugh when they assume someone doesn't understand their world. "Trust me, Mom." That phrase again. Trust me. The problem was that I did trust her. I trusted her heart, or at least the heart she once had. What I no longer trusted was her judgment. As I drove home, one troubling realization became impossible to ignore. Vanessa and Brandon weren't simply interested in a penthouse. They were chasing an image. And they were willing to risk far more than they should in order to obtain it. What neither of them understood was that every step they took toward that dream was bringing them closer to a truth they never expected to discover. A truth waiting quietly inside the very building they were so desperate to impress others with. About 2 weeks after our brunch conversation, Vanessa finally decided to visit my apartment. Not because she wanted to spend time with me, not because she missed me. Because she happened to be in the neighborhood viewing another property. At least that's what she told me when she called. "I'm nearby," she said. "I can stop by for a few minutes." A few minutes. The phrase sounded more like an obligation than an invitation. Still, I said yes. She's my daughter. No matter how complicated things became, I would never stop wanting to see her. That afternoon, I spent a little time tidying the apartment, not because it was messy, because old habits die hard. Richard used to joke that I cleaned before guests arrived, even when the place was already spotless. By 3 o'clock, everything was ready. Fresh coffee, clean counters, soft music playing quietly in the background. The same apartment I had loved for years. The same apartment filled with memories. The same apartment Vanessa seemed incapable of appreciating. When the knock finally came, I opened the door with a smile. Vanessa stepped inside wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a handbag that probably cost more than my first car. She removed the glasses and looked around. Immediately, the inspection began. Her eyes moved across the room. The furniture, the walls, the kitchen, the windows. I knew that look. She wasn't seeing a home. She was evaluating an asset, or in her opinion, a lack of one. It's smaller than I remember. I closed the door. Good to see you too. She laughed lightly. I'm serious. I know. She walked toward the living room. The sofa is the same. Richard liked that sofa. She nodded distractedly. The television is ancient. It still works. She stared at me. Mom. What? You can afford a new television. I smiled. I don't want a new television. That answer visibly confused her. People who define happiness through acquisition often struggle to understand contentment. Vanessa moved into the kitchen. The countertops were older. The appliances weren't modern. The space wasn't impressive. To me, it was perfect. To her, it looked unacceptable. I just don't understand this. I poured coffee. Understand what? She turned toward me. Why you choose to live like this? There it was. The question she had been asking for years, not out of curiosity, out of judgment. I handed her a cup. She accepted it. Sit down. Reluctantly, she did. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she looked around again. Mom, be honest. I usually am. Don't joke. I'm not, she sighed heavily. Doesn't this place embarrass you? The question hit harder than she realized. Not because of what she said, because of what it revealed. Embarrassment had become her lens for viewing the world. Everything was measured through public perception. Everything. No, I said quietly. She frowned. Really? No. Not even a little. I shook my head. This apartment holds some of the happiest memories of my life. Her expression softened briefly, then hardened again. Memories don't pay bills. I nearly laughed. The irony was almost painful. If only she knew. The apartment wasn't evidence of financial failure. It was evidence of choice, a distinction she couldn't seem to grasp. Vanessa stood and walked toward the window. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass. It just feels... She searched for the word. Sad. I looked around the room. The photographs, the books, the furniture Richard and I had chosen together. The memories... Nothing about it felt sad to me. Lonely sometimes, but not sad. You know what feels sad to me? I asked. She turned. What? Living your life worrying about what strangers think? For a second, genuine irritation crossed her face. That's not fair, isn't it? You don't understand. I almost smiled. The phrase again. You don't understand. If she only knew how much I understood, the conversation might have ended there. Unfortunately, it didn't, because Vanessa wasn't finished. She sat down again and leaned forward. Mom, can I be honest? I braced myself. Of course. I worry about you. At first, the statement sounded kind. Then she continued. I worry about what people think. There it was. The truth. Not concern for me. Concern for appearances. When people find out where you live, I felt my chest tighten. They judge? Who judges? She looked uncomfortable. People. Which people? She hesitated. My friends. I nodded slowly. Of course. Her friends. The invisible audience she spent her life performing for. They think it's strange. That I live in an apartment. That you live in this apartment. I set my coffee cup down. Carefully, because suddenly I wasn't hurt. I was tired. Deeply tired. Vanessa. What? Do you hear yourself? Her face reddened. That's not what I mean. Then tell me what you mean. She stood abruptly. What I mean is that you deserve better. No, I shook my head. What you mean is that you think I make you look bad. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that reveals more than words ever could. She didn't deny it. That hurt more than anything she could have said. Then came the moment that would stay with me for a very long time. Vanessa looked around the apartment one final time. Then she laughed softly. Not kindly, not affectionately, mockingly. Mom, this place is practically a shoebox. The words landed like a slap. She continued. I mean, honestly, it's tiny. I stared at her. She kept talking. You could fit my closet in half this apartment. Another laugh. Another careless comment. Each one cutting deeper than she realized. And perhaps deeper than I wanted to admit. Sometimes I think you don't know your own value. My value. I almost smiled. Because that was the tragedy of the situation. Vanessa believed value came from square footage, luxury finishes, prestigious addresses. She had absolutely no idea what true value looked like. At that exact moment, there was another knock at the door. I stood and opened it. Thomas Bennett was standing in the hallway. Afternoon, Pamela. His expression brightened immediately. Sorry to interrupt. No problem. Thomas handed me a maintenance report. A routine document. Nothing unusual. But the interaction that followed wasn't routine. At least not to Vanessa. Because Thomas treated me with unmistakable respect. Not the polite respect given to an elderly tenant. Something more. Something deeper. Everything looks good, he said. Just wanted your approval before we move forward. Thank you, Thomas. He nodded. As always, if you need anything, please call me directly. Not the office, not customer service. Directly. His tone carried a level of deference that most people would notice immediately. Most people except Vanessa. Or perhaps she noticed and simply didn't understand. After Thomas left, she frowned. He seems very attentive. He does a good job. No, she looked thoughtful. I mean, with you. I shrugged. We've known each other a long time. Technically true. Just not the whole truth. Vanessa stared toward the hallway. Something almost clicked. Almost. Then the moment passed. She dismissed it. Just as she dismissed everything else that didn't fit her assumptions. A few minutes later, she gathered her purse and prepared to leave. Before stepping through the door, she turned back toward me. You should think about moving. I smiled sadly. And You should think about listening. She didn't respond. She simply walked away. As I watched the elevator doors close behind her, an uncomfortable realization settled over me. My daughter wasn't merely embarrassed by my apartment anymore. She was embarrassed by me. And the worst part, she still had no idea that every time she insulted this building, she was insulting the woman who owned every single floor of it after Vanessa left my apartment that afternoon. I sat alone in silence for a long time. The conversation kept replaying in my mind. Not because it surprised me, because it confirmed something I had been afraid to admit. My daughter wasn't simply chasing success anymore. She was chasing validation. And the more validation she needed, the more dangerous her decisions became. I spent the next few days focusing on routine matters. Tenant requests, building reports, maintenance budgets, the ordinary responsibilities that came with ownership. Normally, those tasks grounded me. But this time, something felt different, like a storm was approaching. I just didn't know how close it was. The answer arrived sooner than expected. It started with a phone call from Thomas Bennett. "Pamela, do you have a minute?" His tone immediately caught my attention. "Of course." There was a pause. Then he sighed. "I think you need to hear something." My stomach tightened. "What happened?" Thomas hesitated. "Someone contacted our office again." I already knew who. Brandon. Yes. I closed my eyes. "What does he want?" Thomas sounded uncomfortable. He requested a private meeting. That wasn't unusual. Potential buyers often asked questions. Still, something about Thomas's voice suggested there was more. And he implied that certain connections might benefit the building. I sat up straighter. "What kind of connections?" Thomas let out a short laugh. Not an amused laugh. The kind people use when they're annoyed. He basically suggested that if we helped him secure the penthouse at a favorable price, he could introduce us to influential investors. For a moment, I simply stared at the wall. Not because I was shocked, because I was embarrassed. Embarrassed for him. Embarrassed for Vanessa. Embarrassed for the family Richard and I had spent decades building. He tried to negotiate. Not exactly. Thomas paused. It felt more like pressure. The disappointment settled heavily inside me. Pressure, leverage, influence. Those weren't words Richard respected, and they certainly weren't values we taught our daughter. "What did you tell him?" "The same thing I tell everyone." Thomas chuckled. "The price is the price." I smiled despite everything. "Good." Then his voice became serious. "Pamela, there's something else." The smile disappeared. "What?" "I don't think he's finished." Neither did I. After we ended the call, I found myself standing by the window once again. Chicago stretched endlessly before me. Busy. Beautiful. Indifferent. The city had witnessed thousands of stories, thousands of families, thousands of mistakes, and now our family was becoming one of them. That evening, Emily called. Her timing seemed almost uncanny lately, as though she somehow sensed when I needed to hear a familiar voice. "Hi, Grandma." "Hello, sweetheart." "You sound tired." I laughed softly. "You inherited your grandfather's observation skills." I'll take that as a compliment. You should. There was a brief pause. Then Emily asked a question that surprised me. Do you think people can change? I frowned. What brought that on? Another pause. Then she answered quietly. My parents. The sadness in her voice broke my heart. Because 16-year-olds shouldn't sound that weary. They've been fighting more. I'm sorry. They don't even realize it anymore. I listened carefully. Sometimes children reveal truths adults miss. They argue about money. I wasn't surprised. They argue about appearances. That didn't surprise me either. Then Emily said something that did. I think they're scared. Scared. Not angry. Not selfish. Scared. The distinction mattered, because fear often hides beneath arrogance. People who feel secure rarely need to prove their worth. People who feel secure don't spend their lives impressing strangers. I thought about that long after the call ended. Perhaps Vanessa wasn't merely obsessed with status. Perhaps she was terrified of losing it. A few days later, I met Michael Reynolds at his office. The meeting had originally been scheduled to review estate planning documents. Instead, it became something else entirely. Michael was already waiting when I arrived. Several folders sat neatly on his desk. He looked unusually serious. Pamela. Michael. We sat down. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he slid one of the folders toward me. Before we discuss the estate documents, there's something you should see. I opened the folder. The name at the top immediately caught my attention. Brandon Carter. Again. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. What now? Michael folded his hands. I've spent the last few weeks reviewing public records. That wasn't unusual. Good attorneys verify information. Good attorneys prepare for problems before they happen. What did you find? He took a deep breath. More debt than I expected. I wasn't sure why that surprised me. Perhaps because I still wanted to believe the situation wasn't as bad as it appeared. But it was. Several pages later, the reality became impossible to ignore. Credit lines, loans, second mortgages, refinancing agreements. The list seemed endless. I slowly closed the folder. They're drowning. Michael nodded. That's my assessment. The room became very quiet. I thought about Vanessa's expensive clothes, the luxury vehicles, the vacations, the parties, the constant need to project success. And suddenly it all made sense. The louder the performance became, the worse the reality probably was. People often mistake wealth for confidence. In truth, insecurity is frequently much louder. What are they trying to prove? I whispered. Michael gave a sad smile. Maybe they're trying to prove it to themselves. That answer hurt because it felt true. Eventually, our conversation shifted toward another topic. My estate. My assets. The future. Topics I usually approached calmly. This time was different. Because for the first time, I found myself questioning assumptions I had held for years. Who should inherit what, under what conditions, and perhaps, most importantly, would inheritance actually help Vanessa? Or would it simply enable the very behavior destroying her life? Michael seemed to read my thoughts. You've been reconsidering things. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Yes. Because of Vanessa. Another nod. Michael remained quiet, waiting, allowing me to reach my own conclusion. Finally, I spoke. I don't want money to reward bad decisions. No, but I also don't want to punish her. Michael leaned back. There's a difference. Richard had said something similar years ago. Don't use money to punish people. The memory hit me unexpectedly. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice. Then another memory followed. If someone loses their way, let the truth teach them before money does. Truth, not punishment. Truth. Suddenly, everything became clearer. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't looking for humiliation. I was looking for honesty. The kind of honesty our family had been avoiding for years. I looked at Michael. What would it take to organize a building-wide meeting? His eyebrows rose. A resident meeting. Yes. He studied me carefully. You have something in mind. I do. What exactly? I stared out the office window. At the city Richard and I had spent decades building our lives in. At the buildings, the neighborhoods, the people, at everything that mattered. Then I turned back toward him. I think it's time certain truths stop hiding. For several seconds, Michael said nothing. Then a slow understanding appeared on his face. You've made a decision. Yes. Are you sure? I thought about Vanessa, about Emily, about Richard, about everything that had led us here. The mockery, the lies, the obsession with appearances, the growing debt, the pressure, the fear, the distance between mother and daughter. And finally, I nodded. I've never been more sure. Michael closed the folder. When do you want the meeting? I took a slow breath. The answer felt inevitable. Very soon. As I left his office that afternoon, a strange calm settled over me. Not happiness, not satisfaction, certainty. Because for years I had remained silent. For years I had hidden the truth. For years I had hoped Vanessa would find her way back on her own. Now I was beginning to understand something difficult. Sometimes love requires patience. But sometimes love requires revelation. And before this was over, my daughter was going to discover exactly who owned the building she admired so much. She just had no idea how devastating that discovery was about to be. The invitation arrived 3 days later. Not by mail, not by email. Vanessa called personally, which immediately made me suspicious. Mom, we're hosting a dinner party next Saturday. I waited. There was always more. A really important one. Of course, important. That word seemed to appear constantly in Vanessa's vocabulary. Important people. Important clients. Important neighborhoods. Important opportunities. As if ordinary things somehow mattered less. What kind of dinner party? I asked. A networking event. I almost laughed. A networking event disguised as a dinner party. That sounded exactly like something Vanessa would host. We'd love for you to come. The invitation sounded rehearsed. Polished. Carefully delivered. Not warm. Not personal. Still, I accepted. All right. Wonderful. Then came the part I expected. And maybe wear something elegant. I closed my eyes. Not again. Not always with the clothes. Not always with appearances. But I simply replied, I'll see what I can do. After we hung up, I stood by the window for a long time. Something felt wrong. Not dangerous. Not exactly. Just wrong. Like pieces were moving into place. Like a story I hadn't wanted to read was approaching its climax. The following Saturday arrived quickly. The dinner was being held at an upscale private event space overlooking Lake Michigan. A place designed to impress. Crystal chandeliers. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Expensive artwork. Valet parking. Everything Vanessa loved. Everything that signaled status. When I arrived, the room was already full. Men in tailored suits. Women wearing designer dresses. Investors. Executives. Business owners. Developers. The kind of crowd that spent more time discussing assets than people. I immediately spotted Emily. Relief washed over her face the moment she saw me. Grandma, she hugged me tightly. Thank goodness you're here, I smiled. That bad, she glanced around the room. Worse, I laughed softly. Emily had inherited Richard's honesty. One of the few things keeping me hopeful. Across the room, Vanessa was greeting guests. She looked flawless. Elegant black dress. Perfect makeup. Perfect smile. The image of success. Yet now that I knew the truth, I could see what others couldn't. The strain behind her eyes. The tension hidden beneath her confidence. The fear. Fear is funny that way. Most people never notice it. But once you've seen enough of life, it becomes impossible to miss. As the evening progressed, conversations flowed exactly as I expected. People discussed investments, luxury developments, vacation homes, market forecasts, net worth. Everything eventually came back to money. I moved quietly between groups, listening, observing, saying very little. The older I get, the more I realize that silence is underrated. People reveal themselves when they believe nobody important is listening. Unfortunately, that evening, I learned more than I wanted to. Near the bar area, I overheard Brandon speaking with two investors. The penthouse is practically ours. One investor raised an eyebrow. You've already closed. Not yet. Not. Brandon smiled confidently. But we're getting close. I felt my stomach tighten. The confidence wasn't based on facts. It was based on assumptions. Dangerous assumptions. The kind that often lead people into trouble. The investor nodded. Beautiful building. It is. Brandon took a sip of his drink. The ownership structure is a little strange. Though, I nearly smiled. If only he knew. The conversation continued. And with every sentence, my disappointment deepened. Brandon wasn't simply interested in the property. He was treating it like a trophy, a symbol, a way to elevate his social standing. Meanwhile, the financial reality waiting behind that decision was becoming increasingly severe. A little later, dinner was served. Guests took their seats. I found myself near the far end of the table, not hidden, not prominent, exactly where I preferred to be. For a while, things remained pleasant. People laughed. Stories were shared. Wine flowed freely. Then, inevitably, the attention shifted. Toward me. It always did eventually. One guest smiled politely. So, Pamela, Vanessa tells us you live nearby. That's right. Do you enjoy the neighborhood? I do. The guest nodded. Before he could continue, Vanessa jumped into the conversation. Oh, Mom loves her little apartment. The word little carried an unmistakable edge. Several people smiled politely. I remained quiet. Vanessa continued. It's honestly amazing. Her voice dripped with amusement. She's lived there forever. A few guests laughed. Not cruelly, just following her lead. And that's how these things happen. Most cruelty isn't born from malice. It's born from people wanting to belong, wanting to fit in, wanting to laugh when everyone else laughs. Vanessa smiled wider. You should see it. More laughter. It's tiny. Someone chuckled. How tiny? Vanessa looked delighted by the question. Let's just say my walk-in closet might be bigger. The table erupted. Laughter, smiles, grins, and there I sat, listening, feeling every word. Not because I cared about the apartment, because I cared about the person saying those things, my daughter. The little girl Richard and I raised. The child who once cried when another student was being bullied. Now she was entertaining a room full of adults at her mother's expense. I glanced toward Emily. Her face had gone pale. She looked horrified. Good, not because I wanted her upset, because it meant she still recognized the difference between humor and humiliation. Vanessa wasn't finished. Oh, and the furniture. More laughter. Half of it probably qualifies as a historical artifact. The room laughed again. Brandon joined in. It's basically a time capsule. That one earned even more laughter. I lowered my eyes. Not because I was ashamed, because I suddenly felt very tired. Tired of pretending these comments didn't hurt. Tired of watching my daughter become someone I barely recognized. Tired of waiting for her to remember who she used to be. Then something unexpected happened. A woman sitting several seats away froze. Completely froze. Our eyes met. And instantly I recognized her. Margaret Whitmore, one of Chicago's most respected real estate investors. We had crossed paths numerous times over the years. Not socially, professionally. She knew exactly who I was. And judging by her expression, she had just realized whose mother Vanessa Carter happened to be. For a split second, shock crossed her face, then confusion, then understanding. Margaret slowly looked from me to Vanessa, then back to me. The realization was obvious. She knew. She knew everything. She knew who owned the building. She knew who had been quietly investing in Chicago real estate for decades. She knew the woman being mocked at the dinner table wasn't some struggling widow. I could practically see the calculations happening inside her mind. Then she opened her mouth, probably to say something. Anything. I quickly shook my head. A tiny movement, barely noticeable. But enough. Margaret immediately understood. She closed her mouth, said nothing, protected the secret, at least for now. The dinner continued. Vanessa remained blissfully unaware. Brandon remained confident. The guests continued laughing and socializing, but something had changed. At least for me. Because sitting there, listening to my daughter ridicule me in front of a room full of strangers, I finally understood something. The truth could not remain hidden much longer. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to embarrass Vanessa, because she had reached a point where only the truth could reach her. And for the first time, I found myself wondering if that moment was much closer than anyone realized, especially my daughter. I barely slept after Vanessa's dinner party, not because I was angry. Anger comes and goes. What kept me awake was grief. The quiet kind. The kind that settles into your chest and refuses to leave. I sat alone in my apartment long after midnight, staring out at the lights of Chicago. The city looked peaceful from this height. Cars moved through their streets below. Windows glowed in distant buildings. Life continued as it always had. Yet inside me, something had shifted. For years, I had convinced myself that patience was enough, that if I loved Vanessa hard enough, quietly enough, long enough, she would eventually find her way back. But sitting there in the darkness, I finally accepted a difficult truth. Love cannot force someone to see. At some point, they must choose to open their own eyes. The question was whether Vanessa was capable of doing that before it was too late. My gaze drifted toward the framed photograph beside the window. Richard. The picture had been taken during one of our last vacations together. He was smiling. The same calm smile that had carried us through every challenge life placed in front of us. Cancer. Financial struggles. Family conflicts. He always seemed to see farther ahead than everyone else, including me. I picked up the photograph. I wish you were here. The words escaped before I realized I had spoken them aloud. Silence answered, as it always did. But then, as strange as it sounds, I found myself remembering a conversation we had years earlier. It happened shortly after Vanessa graduated college. She had landed her first major job. We were celebrating over dinner. At one point, Richard watched her enthusiastically discussing career goals and future plans. After she left the table, he looked at me. She's ambitious. I smiled proudly. That's a good thing. It is. He hesitated. Then he added quietly, as long as ambition remains a passenger. I frowned. What does that mean? His answer stayed with me for decades. It becomes dangerous when it starts driving. At the time, I thought he was worrying too much. Now, sitting alone years later, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Vanessa's ambition had stopped serving her. Now she was serving it. And it was leading her somewhere painful. The next morning, I called Michael Reynolds. Can you meet today? His voice immediately became serious. Of course. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in his office. Several folders rested on the conference table. Estate plans, trust documents, property records, the accumulated results of a lifetime of work. Michael studied me carefully. You've made another decision. I nodded. Yes. What kind of decision? I looked down at the paperwork. For years, these documents had remained largely unchanged. Simple, straightforward. Everything eventually flowed toward Vanessa. That had always been the plan. Not because she deserved special treatment, because she was my daughter, because parents naturally want to help their children. But now things felt different. Not because I loved her less, because I feared what unrestricted inheritance might do. I want to make some changes. Michael wasn't surprised. I thought you might. I slid one document toward him. I don't want wealth to become a reward for arrogance. He nodded slowly. Understandable. But I also don't want to punish her. Good. I looked up. What do you mean? Michael folded his hands. Because punishment rarely teaches people anything. Richard used to say that too. I smiled sadly. You're starting to sound like my husband. Michael laughed softly. I'll take that as a compliment. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every major document, carefully, methodically. The process wasn't emotional. It was practical, which somehow made it even harder. Because every change forced me to confront reality. The reality that my daughter might not be ready to inherit what Richard and I spent decades building. Not yet. Eventually. Michael set his pen down. Finished. I stared at the paperwork. A strange mixture of sadness and relief washed over me. Not because I wanted these changes, because they felt necessary. Then Michael asked the question I'd been expecting. What about the meeting? I leaned back. The meeting, the truth, the moment everything changed. What preparations have been made? Almost everything. I nodded. Good. The building-wide resident meeting was scheduled for the following week. Officially, it concerned several administrative matters. Unofficially, it would accomplish something far more important. It would end years of secrecy. Michael studied me carefully. You still have time to reconsider. I smiled. No, I don't. You're sure? I thought about Vanessa standing in front of a room full of people laughing at me. I thought about Brandon trying to pressure management. I thought about the debt, the lies, the image they were desperately trying to maintain. Most importantly, I thought about Emily. Sweet Emily, watching her parents lose themselves. Watching her grandmother remain silent. Watching a family drift further apart. No, I said quietly. I don't think I have time anymore. That afternoon, I returned home feeling emotionally exhausted, yet strangely peaceful. The decision had been made. The path forward was clear. Now all that remained was allowing events to unfold. 2 days later, Emily visited unexpectedly. I was baking when she knocked. The moment I opened the door, she wrapped her arms around me. No explanation. No greeting, just a hug. Sometimes that's all people need. We sat in the kitchen drinking tea. Eventually she spoke. Grandma, yes, can I ask you something? Anything. She stared into her cup. Why do you never fight back? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? You know? She looked up. When Mom says things. When people underestimate you. When people treat you unfairly, I smiled gently. Life teaches you that not every battle deserves your energy. Emily frowned. But some do. Smart girl. Very smart. I considered my answer carefully. You're right. Her eyes widened slightly. I am? Sometimes standing up for yourself is necessary. Then why don't you? I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Maybe because I've been waiting for the right moment? Emily stared at me. Something about her expression told me she sensed there was more beneath those words. But thankfully, she didn't press further. Instead, she changed the subject. For the next hour, we talked about school, friends, books, normal things, healthy things, the kinds of conversations families should have more often. After she left, I found myself smiling for the first time in days. Emily gave me hope. Hope that the values Richard and I cherished hadn't disappeared entirely. Hope that kindness still mattered. Hope that truth still mattered. Hope that family wasn't completely lost. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the Chicago skyline, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Michael. Just 3 words. Everything is ready. I stared at the screen. 3 simple words, yet they carried enormous weight. Because they marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The truth was ready. The documents were ready. The meeting was ready. And whether Vanessa realized it or not, her entire understanding of her mother was about to be shattered. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted humiliation, but because sometimes people become so lost in appearances that only reality can bring them home. And for the first time in years, I believed reality was finally about to knock on my daughter's door. The morning of the resident meeting arrived gray and overcast. Chicago seemed wrapped in a blanket of clouds. The weather matched my mood perfectly. Calm on the surface, unsettled underneath. I woke earlier than usual. Not because I was nervous. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The truth was more complicated. I wasn't afraid of what was about to happen. I was afraid of what might happen afterward. Because once the truth entered a room, it could never be removed. And by the end of that day, the truth would belong to everyone. I made coffee, sat by the window, looked at Richard's photograph, the same ritual that had carried me through difficult moments for years. Well, I whispered. I suppose it's time. For a moment, I imagined what he would say. Probably something practical, something steady, something that would make me smile despite myself. Then I stood, got dressed, and prepared for a day that would change my family forever. The meeting was scheduled for 6 o'clock that evening in the building's community hall. Official notices had gone out to residents a week earlier. Most expected a routine meeting, budget updates, maintenance plans, future improvements. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. Only a handful of people knew otherwise. Michael Reynolds, Thomas Bennett, Margaret Whitmore, and me. Everyone else would discover the truth together, including my daughter. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang. Vanessa, I answered immediately. Hello, sweetheart. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. A bad sign. I've learned that excessive confidence often precedes embarrassment. Mom, are you going to the resident meeting tonight? Interesting. Yes, good. She sounded pleased. Brandon and I will be there too. I already knew that. What for? She laughed. We want to learn more about the penthouse. Of course, even now, even after everything, the penthouse remained the focus. The prize, the symbol, the thing she believed would somehow validate her life. I closed my eyes briefly. All right. We might finally get answers about ownership. I almost smiled. Yes, you certainly will. We'll see. After we hung up, I stared at the phone for several seconds. The irony felt almost unbearable. Vanessa was excited about discovering the building's owner, completely unaware she had spent years insulting that person. By 5:30, residents began arriving. The community hall gradually filled. People greeted one another, neighbors chatted, coffee was served. The atmosphere remained relaxed. Ordinary. I arrived through a side entrance and took a seat near the front. Not because I wanted attention, because Michael requested it. Across the room, Thomas was organizing paperwork. His expression remained professional. But I knew him well enough to recognize tension. This mattered to him too. A few minutes later, Brandon and Vanessa entered. Even from across the room, I could see their confidence. Brandon wore an expensive suit. Vanessa looked elegant as always. They moved through the crowd, shaking hands and smiling, performing, networking, positioning themselves exactly as they always did. Then Brandon spotted me. He walked over immediately. Pamela, I smiled. Hello, Brandon? He took a seat beside me. Vanessa joined him. Neither noticed anything unusual. Neither questioned why I was sitting near the front. Neither questioned why Thomas greeted me with a respectful nod. The assumptions remained firmly intact. Big turnout, Brandon said. It is. I'm curious to finally meet ownership. I nodded. I imagine you are, Vanessa smiled. Maybe we'll learn something useful. Useful. An interesting choice of words. A few moments later, Emily arrived. Relief crossed her face when she saw me. She immediately chose the empty seat beside mine. Not beside her parents. Beside me. That detail did not escape Vanessa, nor did it escape me. At exactly 6 o'clock, the meeting began. Thomas stepped forward first. The opening portion proceeded normally. Maintenance updates. Renovation schedules, security improvements, financial reports. Everything residents expected. For nearly 30 minutes, nothing unusual happened. Then Thomas glanced toward Michael. The signal, the moment, the room gradually grew quiet. Michael stood. Most residents recognized him as legal counsel. Few knew why he was there. Vanessa leaned forward. Interested, Brandon did the same. Michael adjusted his glasses, then began speaking. Thank you all for attending. City. His voice carried effortlessly across the room. As many of you know, questions regarding long-term ownership and future plans for the building have increased over the past several years. I watched Vanessa, still relaxed, still confident, still unaware. Michael continued. Tonight, Ownership has authorized us to provide additional transparency. Several residents nodded. Others looked curious. Brandon smiled. The smile of a man expecting favorable news. Michael opened a folder. Before discussing future initiatives, ownership has requested a formal introduction. Silence spread through the room. The kind of silence that precedes important moments. Then Michael spoke the sentence that changed everything. The sole owner of this building is Pamela Hudson. For a second, nobody reacted, not because they didn't hear him, because they were processing what they had heard. The room froze. Completely. Every face turned toward me. Every conversation died instantly. Every assumption collapsed. Beside me, Emily's eyes widened. Across the aisle, Thomas smiled slightly. Margaret Whitmore looked entirely unsurprised. And directly to my right, Vanessa stopped breathing. At least it seemed that way. Her entire body went rigid. The color drained from her face. No. The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. Brandon looked equally stunned. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. Michael calmly continued. Tiens. Mrs. Hudson has owned the property for many years. The room erupted into whispers. Confusion, shock, disbelief. Questions flew in every direction. Meanwhile, Vanessa stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. Mom! Her voice barely existed. I turned toward her. Hello, sweetheart. She shook her head. No. Again. No. The denial sounded almost childlike, as though rejecting reality might somehow change it. You own the building? I nodded. Yes. The room remained frozen around us. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Brandon finally found his voice. This isn't possible. Michael calmly handed several documents to attendees seated near the front. Ownership records, legal filings, proof, undeniable proof. The evidence spread through the room like wildfire. Faces changed as people read. Shock transformed into certainty. The truth became impossible to challenge. Vanessa looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. How long? I answered honestly. A very long time. She stared, unable to process it, unable to reconcile the woman she thought she knew with the reality sitting beside her. Then Michael delivered the second revelation, the one even Vanessa wasn't prepared for. Additionally, Mrs. Hudson has requested disclosure regarding several private financial matters relevant to her family. My daughter looked completely lost now. Michael opened another folder. I knew exactly what it contained. The records, the transfers, the quiet assistance, the sacrifices nobody knew about. For years. Over the past decade, Michael continued, Mrs. Hudson has personally funded multiple financial interventions that directly benefited members of her family. The room became silent again. A different silence this time. Heavier, more uncomfortable. Vanessa's eyes moved slowly toward me. Confusion, fear, realization, all colliding at once. What does that mean? She whispered. I looked directly into her eyes, the same eyes I first saw in a hospital 42 years earlier. The same eyes that had once looked at me with complete trust. "It means," I said softly, "that there are things you don't know." The tears began forming instantly. Not mine, hers. And for the first time in years, my daughter looked less like a successful executive and more like a frightened little girl. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire room seemed frozen in place. I had experienced difficult moments in my life before. The day Richard received his diagnosis. The day we buried him. The day Vanessa left for college. But this felt different. This was the moment when years of assumptions collided with reality. And reality was winning. Vanessa stared at me as if she had never seen me before. Perhaps, in a way, she hadn't for years. She had viewed me through a story she created in her own mind. The retired widow, the elderly mother, the woman living in a small apartment because life had somehow passed her by. That story had just collapsed. And she didn't know what to replace it with. "Mom!" Her voice trembled. I hated hearing that, because despite everything, she was still my daughter. Still the little girl who used to run into my arms after school. Still the child I loved more than life itself. "What is all this?" she whispered. I looked at her calmly. "The truth." Brandon suddenly stood. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is insane." Several residents turned toward him. Michael remained composed. "There is nothing insane about documented ownership records." Brandon's face reddened. "No," he pointed toward me. "I mean this." His voice rose. "Why wouldn't you tell us?" The question hung in the air. A fair question, at least on the surface. I met his eyes. "Did you ever ask?" Silence. Brandon looked caught off guard, because the answer was obvious. No, neither he nor Vanessa had ever asked about my life. Not really. They had made assumptions, and assumptions had become facts inside their minds. Michael quietly resumed speaking. "Mrs. Hudson has also requested disclosure regarding financial assistance provided to immediate family members over the years." Vanessa slowly turned toward him. Her face had become pale, almost colorless. "What assistance?" Michael opened another folder. The room grew silent again. A different kind of silence now. Anticipation. Unease. The feeling that something even bigger was coming. Because it was... Michael adjusted his glasses. Approximately 11 years ago, when a business investment incurred significant losses, Mrs. Hudson provided financial support through a private intermediary. Vanessa blinked. "What?" Michael continued. 8 years ago, when a mortgage refinancing application encountered difficulties, Mrs. Hudson intervened financially." My daughter's eyes widened. "No." She looked toward me. "No, that's not possible." I remained quiet. Michael wasn't finished. 5 years ago, during a period of substantial credit card debt restructuring, Mrs. Hudson again provided assistance. The room felt smaller, heavier, Every sentence landed like another stone. Every revelation dismantled another piece of Vanessa's understanding. She stared at me, completely stunned. I never knew. I know. Her voice cracked. You paid those debts. Some of them. The words were simple. The effect was devastating. Tears immediately appeared in her eyes. Not dramatic tears, not performative tears, real tears, the kind people cannot control. For the first time that evening, I saw genuine vulnerability. Then something unexpected happened. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by anger. Raw anger. Vanessa stood abruptly. Why would you do this? Several people exchanged confused looks. Even Michael looked surprised. Do what? I asked quietly. This. She gestured wildly around the room. Humiliate me. There it was. The accusation I knew was coming. The need to make herself the victim. The refusal to confront what was truly happening. I took a slow breath. Vanessa. No. Her voice rose again. You could have told me privately. I could have. Then why didn't you? Because you never listened. Because you never asked. Because you cared more about appearances than truth. Because every opportunity to understand me was replaced by judgment. I thought all those things. But I didn't say them. Instead, I answered honestly, because the problem wasn't the secret. She stared. It was what the secret revealed. The room fell silent once more. Even Brandon stopped talking. For a moment, Vanessa looked genuinely confused. Then slowly, painfully, understanding began to form. Not complete understanding, but enough to hurt, enough to matter. You think I'm shallow. The words barely escaped her lips. I didn't answer immediately. Because this wasn't about winning. It wasn't about being right. It was about honesty. Finally, I spoke. I think you've been lost. The tears returned. And this time, they stayed. Across the room, Emily sat perfectly still. Watching, listening, learning. I hated that she had to witness this. But perhaps it was unavoidable. Perhaps families sometimes need to break before they can heal. Then Michael spoke again. And everything became even more complicated. There is one final matter. The room collectively tensed. One final matter. The phrase sounded ominous. Because it was, Michael looked toward me. I nodded. Proceed. He opened another document. Mrs. Hudson recently revised portions of her estate planning. Vanessa froze. Brandon froze. Even I felt the weight of the moment, because this wasn't about the past anymore. This was about the future. Michael continued carefully. The revisions include conditional provisions tied to stewardship, responsibility, and demonstrated personal growth. Brandon frowned. What does that mean? Michael looked directly at him. It means inheritance is no longer automatic. The words landed like a bomb. Gasps echoed throughout the room. Vanessa's eyes widened. What? Michael remained calm. The estate structure has been modified. My daughter looked as though she had been struck physically. For years, She had probably assumed everything would eventually pass to her, not because she was greedy, because that is what normally happens. Parents leave assets to their children. Simple, expected, predictable. Except life is rarely that simple. And inheritance without wisdom can become a curse. I finally stood, slowly, carefully. The room immediately became silent. Every eye focused on me. For the first time that evening, I addressed everyone, not as a mother, not as a widow, not as a building owner, simply as Pamela Hudson. My husband spent decades building something meaningful. My voice remained steady. He believed wealth should serve people. I glanced toward Vanessa. He believed character mattered more than status. Then toward Emily. He believed kindness mattered more than appearance. Tears rolled down Vanessa's cheeks. Uncontrolled now. Visible to everyone. Good. Not because I wanted her pain, because sometimes pain creates openings that pride cannot. I continued. This was never about money. The room listened carefully. It was never about property. I looked directly at my daughter. It was about values. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For the first time all evening, the truth stood completely exposed. Not the truth about ownership, not the truth about inheritance. The deeper truth, the real truth, somewhere along the way. My daughter had stopped valuing the things that actually mattered. And now she was finally being forced to face it. Then Brandon unexpectedly spoke. Quietly, almost reluctantly. There is something I need to say. The room turned toward him. His face looked different now. Less confident. Less polished. More honest. For the first time since I'd known him. He swallowed hard, then looked directly at Vanessa. And what he said next stunned everyone, including me. Vanessa. His voice cracked. I knew! The room erupted. What? Vanessa whispered. Brandon lowered his eyes. I didn't know everything. Silence. But I knew enough. My heart stopped. What exactly did he mean? How much had he known? How long had he known it? Vanessa stared at her husband in disbelief. The betrayal hit her immediately. And for the first time that night, I realized the biggest confrontation wasn't going to be between mother and daughter. It was about to happen between husband and wife. The ride home was one of the longest of my life, not because of traffic, not because of distance, because silence occupied every corner of the car. Emily sat beside me. Neither of us spoke much. We didn't need to. The events of the evening were still settling inside both of us. Outside, Chicago moved as it always had. Traffic lights changed. Pedestrians crossed streets. Restaurants filled with customers. The world continued. Meanwhile, our family had just been turned upside down. When I finally pulled into the parking garage beneath the building, Emily looked at me. Grandma? Yes. Her voice was quiet. Careful. Are you okay? I smiled. A genuine smile. One of the few I'd managed all evening. I think so. She nodded slowly. Then she said something that nearly made me cry. I'm proud of you. I looked away for a moment. Toward the windshield. Toward the city lights. Anywhere but directly at her. Because sometimes kindness hurts more than cruelty. Especially when you need it. Thank you, sweetheart. Emily hugged me before climbing out of the car. A few minutes later, I rode the elevator alone. For the first time in years, the building felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, because the secret was gone. The burden of hiding was gone. The truth was finally free. And yet, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only sadness. Because no mother dreams of teaching her child a lesson this way. Inside my apartment, I sat in Richard's favorite chair and stared into the darkness. The silence felt enormous. Eventually, my phone buzzed. Vanessa. I stared at the screen. Let it ring, then stop. A few seconds later, it rang again. And again. And again. By midnight, she had called 9 times. I answered none of them. Not because I wanted to punish her, because neither of us was ready for that conversation. Not yet. The following morning brought something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness, not relief, just peace. The truth had been spoken. Now everyone needed time to absorb it, including me. For the next several days, life returned to a routine of sorts. I handled building business, met with Thomas, reviewed budgets, visited residents, the ordinary work that had always grounded me. And gradually, I found comfort there. One afternoon, I stopped by the apartment of Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, an 81-year-old widow who had lived in the building for nearly 15 years. She greeted me warmly. "Pamela, Eleanor, you have a minute? For you always?" We sat together drinking tea, talking about ordinary things. Health, books, weather, the simple conversations that remind you what truly matters. At one point, Eleanor looked at me carefully. "I heard about the meeting." I smiled. "News travels fast," she laughed. "Especially in this building." Then her expression softened. "You've helped a lot of people here." I shook my head. "Richard helped too." "Maybe." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "But you're the one still here." The words stayed with me after I left, because they reminded me of something important. The building was never about ownership. It was about people. Always people. Meanwhile, across town, things were unraveling for Vanessa. I didn't know the full extent immediately. Pieces arrived gradually. A phone call here, a conversation there. Information has a way of traveling through cities, especially among professional circles. The first sign came from Margaret Whitmore. She called unexpectedly. "I thought you should know." My stomach tightened. "What happened?" Margaret sighed. "People are talking." Of course they were. Chicago's business community loved gossip almost as much as it loved money. "What are they saying?" "Mostly about Vanessa." I closed my eyes. Not because I was surprised. Because I had hoped she might be spared some of it. Apparently not. Margaret continued. The story spread quickly. The successful executive who publicly mocked her mother. The wealthy daughter whose mother secretly owned the building she wanted to impress people with. The irony was irresistible. People love irony, especially when it happens to someone else. How bad? Margaret hesitated. Bad. That evening, Emily called. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. Grandma. What happened? Silence. Then a shaky breath. Mom's not doing well. My heart sank. Oh, what do you mean? She barely leaves the house. I listened carefully. She's embarrassed. Of course she was. But embarrassment wasn't what worried me. Shame was. Because shame has a way of turning inward, of convincing people they are failures rather than simply people who made mistakes. How's Brandon? Emily laughed bitterly. Not a sound I liked hearing from a 16-year-old. They fight all the time now. My stomach tightened. What about everything? That answer worried me even more. Because when couples start fighting about everything, they're usually fighting about one thing: fear. The conversation continued, and with every minute, the picture became clearer. Financial pressure, public embarrassment, damaged relationships, years of problems suddenly rising to the surface. The meeting hadn't created those problems. It had simply exposed them. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, thinking, remembering, praying. Because despite everything, I didn't want Vanessa destroyed. I wanted her healed. There is a difference, a very important difference. 1 week later, another piece of news arrived. This one from Michael Reynolds. His voice sounded unusually serious. We need to talk. That phrase never means anything good. What happened? Vanessa's situation is worse than we thought. My stomach dropped. How much worse? There was a pause. Then he answered. A lot. We met the following afternoon. The documents he showed me were sobering. Debt. Missed payments. Declining credit. Financial strain far beyond what I had imagined. I stared at the paperwork. For several seconds. I couldn't speak. Not because of the numbers. Because of what they represented. Fear, desperation, pride. Years of pretending everything was fine. Then Michael delivered the final blow. The bank has started proceedings. I looked up sharply. What proceedings? His expression softened. The answer came quietly. They may lose the house. The words hit me like a punch. Despite everything, despite the mockery, despite the humiliation, despite all of it, my first thought wasn't anger. It was heartbreak. Because that house wasn't just a house. It was where Emily lived, where family holidays happened, where memories existed. And now it was at risk. I stared out the office window. The city skyline blurred slightly. For a moment, I thought about calling Vanessa, offering help, writing a check, making the problem disappear. It would be easy, very easy. But Richard's voice echoed in my memory. If someone loses their way, let the truth teach them before money does. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about transformation. and transformation cannot be purchased. That evening, I returned home carrying a sadness I hadn't felt in years. The truth had been revealed. The lesson had begun. But the cost was becoming painfully real. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether my daughter would find her way back before everything she had built collapsed around her. 3 days after learning that Vanessa and Brandon might lose their house, I received a knock on my apartment door. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I assumed it was Thomas. Perhaps a maintenance issue. Perhaps a resident concern. Instead, when I opened the door, I found my daughter standing in the hallway. Alone. No designer handbag, no carefully selected outfit, no polished confidence. Just Vanessa. And for the first time in years, she looked exhausted. Her eyes were red, her shoulders slumped. The woman standing before me looked 10 years older than the executive who had mocked my apartment only weeks earlier. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "Can I come in?" My heart broke. Not because of what she said, because of how she said it, like a child asking permission. Like someone who wasn't sure she still belonged. I stepped aside. Of course. She entered slowly, looking around the apartment. The same apartment she had ridiculed countless times. But this time, something was different. She wasn't judging it. She was seeing it, really seeing it. The photographs, the books, the worn furniture, the memories, the life. I watched her eyes settle on a framed picture of Richard. She stared at it for a long moment, then sat down quietly. I brought her tea. She accepted it with trembling hands. Still no words. Eventually, she broke the silence. "I was horrible to you." The sentence hung between us. Simple, honest, painful. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I disagreed, because I wanted her to continue. And she did. For the next several minutes, the words poured out. No excuses. No defensiveness, just truth. Raw truth. I don't know when it happened. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I don't know when I became this person. I remained silent, listening. Sometimes people need witnesses more than advice. I watched the video. I frowned. What video? The recording from the dinner party? My stomach tightened. Someone had apparently recorded the event. That wasn't surprising. In today's world, everything gets recorded. Everything. Vanessa wiped her eyes. "I saw myself." Her voice cracked. "I heard myself." More tears. I couldn't believe it. For years, she had justified her behavior, minimized it, rationalized it. But now she had been forced to view it from the outside, the way everyone else saw it. And she hated what she found. I sounded cruel. I nodded gently. Yes. She closed her eyes. The honesty hurt. But honesty was necessary. I sounded like a bully. Another nod. Yes. The tears came harder. And this time, she didn't try to stop them. For nearly a minute, she simply cried. Not elegantly, not dramatically, just honestly. When she finally spoke again, Her voice was barely audible. "You must be so disappointed in me." The question cut deeply. Because disappointment wasn't what I felt. Not anymore. I moved to the chair beside her. Then I took her hand. The same hand I had held when she learned to walk. The same hand I held crossing streets. The same hand I squeezed before school plays and doctor appointments. "Vanessa?" She looked up, eyes swollen, face wet with tears. "I'm disappointed in some choices." I squeezed her hand gently. "But I am not disappointed in my daughter." Fresh tears appeared immediately. Because deep down, that's what she had feared. Not losing money, not losing status, losing love. And that was never going to happen, no matter what. A mother can be hurt. A mother can be angry. A mother can be heartbroken. But love survives all of it. Eventually. Vanessa looked around the apartment again, this time more carefully. "I never noticed. What?" She gestured toward the room. "How peaceful it is here." I smiled. "Most people don't." Another silence followed. Comfortable this time. Healing. Then her expression changed. Darkened. "There is something else. I already knew. Brandon. Tell me." She stared into her tea. "We've been lying for years." The confession came quietly, like a weight finally being set down. "We weren't broke." She paused. "But we weren't successful either." I listened. "We kept borrowing." Another pause. "Refinancing." Another. "Spending." The word sounded painful. Embarrassing. Necessary. Every time we got ahead, we spent more. I nodded slowly. A trap many people fall into, especially those seeking validation. At some point, we stopped building a life. Her voice trembled. "We started building an image." The sentence hit me hard because it perfectly described the problem. Not greed, not evil, image. The desperate pursuit of appearing successful. A pursuit that often destroys actual success. Then came the revelation I hadn't expected. The penthouse wasn't even my idea. I frowned. "What do you mean?" She laughed bitterly. "Brandon became obsessed with it." My stomach tightened. "I thought he just liked it." "He did." She looked away. "But he also thought owning it would prove we'd made it." There it was again. Prove. As though success required witnesses. As though self-worth required approval. As though happiness required an audience. Vanessa wiped another tear away. "I kept going along with it." "Why?" Her answer came instantly. Because she'd already thought about it. Because she'd been asking herself the same question. "I was afraid." The honesty stunned me. Afraid of what? Losing everything. I stared at her. "Everything." She laughed sadly. "No." A pause. Looking like I'd lost everything. That distinction mattered. More than she realized. And judging by her expression, she finally understood it too. An hour later, another knock sounded at the door. Both of us looked up. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, I found Emily standing there, The moment she saw her mother sitting inside, her eyes widened. "Mom," Vanessa stood immediately. For a second, neither moved. Then Emily crossed the room and hugged her tightly. Without hesitation, without conditions, without judgment, the way family should, Vanessa broke down completely, sobbing. The kind of crying that comes from months, sometimes years, of caring too much. I quietly stepped into the kitchen and gave them privacy. Some moments belong to mothers and daughters. Others belong to daughters and daughters. This was one of those moments. 20 minutes later, Emily joined me. Her eyes were red too, but she was smiling, a genuine smile. "She's changing." I looked toward the living room. Vanessa sat quietly on the sofa. Not healed, not fixed, but different. The walls were cracking. The performance was ending. The real person was beginning to emerge. "I think so too." Emily leaned against me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she asked a question. One I had been asking myself for weeks. What happens now? I looked toward my daughter, toward the woman she had become. And perhaps, more importantly, toward the woman she might still become. The answer came softly. Honestly, I don't know. Then I smiled, but for the first time in a long time. I watched Vanessa quietly studying the apartment she once mocked. I think we're finally moving in the right direction. What I didn't know was that an even bigger challenge was still waiting. Because healing relationships would be difficult. Saving a family from financial collapse would be even harder. And Brandon Carter still had a choice to make. A choice that would determine whether this family healed together. Or broke apart forever. A week after Vanessa came to my apartment, she returned. This time, she didn't arrive in a luxury SUV. She drove an older sedan she had borrowed from a friend. The sight alone told me how much had changed. Or perhaps how much was finally becoming visible. When I opened the door, she smiled nervously. Not the polished smile she used at corporate events. Not the confident smile she wore at parties. A real smile. Small, fragile, human. "Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart." She stepped inside. And once again, I noticed something different. She wasn't scanning the apartment anymore. She wasn't judging, comparing, evaluating. Instead, she seemed to be absorbing it, like someone exploring a place for the very first time. Which, in a way, she was. For years, she had looked at this apartment. Now she was finally seeing it. We spent the afternoon together. No lectures, no arguments, no discussions about money, just conversation. The kind families are supposed to have. At one point, Vanessa wandered into the small hallway that connected the bedroom and living room. I watched her stop in front of a framed photograph. It showed Richard sitting in a chair by the window, a blanket draped across his lap, a gentle smile on his face. The picture had been taken only a few weeks before he died. Vanessa stared at it, then looked toward me. "I've never seen this one." I walked over. "Your father liked that photograph." She touched the frame lightly. "He looks peaceful." He was... The room became quiet. Then she asked a question I had been expecting for years. Why did you stay here? Not why did you live here? Why did you stay? A very different question. I looked around the apartment. The walls, the furniture, the memories, and finally answered honestly, because this was where your father spent his last months. Vanessa froze. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then slowly, she sat down. I sat beside her. Neither of us rushed the conversation. Some truths deserve space. After the diagnosis, I began. We had options. She listened carefully. We could have moved. We could have bought a larger place. We could have relocated anywhere we wanted. I smiled softly. But your father refused. Why? I looked toward the window. The same window Richard loved. The same view he watched during those final months. Because he loved this place. Tears immediately appeared in Vanessa's eyes. I continued. He said this apartment felt like home. The words brought back memories with startling clarity. The smell of coffee in the mornings. The sound of Richard's laughter. The conversations that lasted late into the night. The ordinary moments that become priceless once they're gone. He spent his final Christmas here. I pointed toward a corner of the living room. That's where the tree stood. Vanessa followed my gaze. He opened presents there. Another point. Emily sat on his lap right there. More tears. The apartment was transforming before her eyes. No longer a tiny, embarrassing space. Now it was something else entirely. A sanctuary, a history, a collection of love. I stood and walked toward a small wooden cabinet, then opened a drawer. Inside were several journals. Richard's journals. I carried them back and placed them on the table. Vanessa looked confused. What are these? Your father's writings. Her eyes widened. He kept journals. For years. She picked one up carefully, almost reverently, as though touching something sacred, because she was... Inside those pages lived pieces of a man she missed deeply. A man who had shaped both our lives. A man whose influence remained even after death. Vanessa slowly opened one of the journals. Several minutes passed as she silently read. Then suddenly she stopped. Her hand moved to her mouth. What? She turned the journal toward me. I immediately recognized the page. Richard had written it nearly 15 years earlier. Long before he became sick. Long before our family began drifting apart. Long before any of this happened. The entry was about Vanessa, specifically his hopes for her future. Tears rolled down her face as she read aloud. I hope our daughter never measures her worth by money. Her voice broke. She continued. I hope she remembers that kindness is more impressive than success. More tears. And I hope that when she becomes successful, and I believe she will, she never forgets where she came from. Silence filled the room. The painful kind. The healing kind. Sometimes they're the same thing. Vanessa closed the journal. then cried harder than I'd seen her cry in years. Not because of guilt, because of grief. Because she suddenly understood how far she had wandered from the values her father cherished, and perhaps even from the person she once was. Eventually, she looked at me. I failed him. The statement broke my heart. Because it wasn't true. No. I moved closer. You got lost. Fresh tears appeared. There's a difference. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Vanessa surprised me. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you save us? The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuine, curious, painfully honest. I understood exactly what she meant. Why didn't I simply write a check? Why didn't I eliminate the debt? Why didn't I rescue her from the consequences? I thought carefully before answering. Because the truth mattered. Because money wasn't your biggest problem. She stared. I continued. Your biggest problem was believing money could solve everything. The words landed softly, but powerfully. She looked down and slowly nodded. Because she knew I was right. The house, the debt, the stress, those were symptoms, not causes. The cause was deeper. A life built around appearances. A life built around approval. A life built around proving worth rather than knowing it. Then, another knock sounded at the door. When I opened it, I found Brandon standing outside. Alone. Nervous, completely unlike the man I'd known for years. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then he quietly asked, "May I come in?" I looked at Vanessa. She looked back at me, then slowly nodded. I stepped aside. Brandon entered. The atmosphere immediately became tense. Not hostile, just uncertain, like three people standing on unfamiliar ground. He sat across from us, hands clasped tightly, eyes lowered. Finally, he spoke. I owe both of you an apology. No excuses, no explanations, no justifications, just accountability. The room remained silent as he continued. I spent years chasing things I thought would make me feel successful. He laughed bitterly. And the closer I got, the emptier I felt. I saw Vanessa watching him carefully, perhaps seeing him clearly for the first time too. Brandon looked toward me. I should never have treated you the way I did. I nodded. He swallowed hard. I was wrong. Simple words. Yet, some of the hardest words a person can say. For the next hour, the three of us talked. Honestly, painfully, without pretending, without performing, without hiding. And somewhere during that conversation, something remarkable happened. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something better. Understanding. The foundation forgiveness is built upon. As evening settled over Chicago, we sat together in the apartment that Vanessa once called a shoebox. The apartment she once found embarrassing. The apartment she now understood. And as she looked around at the photographs, the memories, and the traces of her father that still lived within these walls, she finally saw what I had always seen. This wasn't the smallest place I'd ever lived. It was the richest. Because every corner contained love. And for the first time in many years, I believed my daughter finally understood that. The first real sign that Vanessa had changed appeared on a rainy Tuesday morning. Not in a dramatic speech, not in a grand apology, not in some life-changing declaration. It appeared in the lobby of my building, quietly, unexpectedly, beautifully. I had just finished reviewing maintenance reports with Thomas when I noticed someone helping Mrs. Eleanor Brooks carry groceries. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then I looked closer. Vanessa, Mrs. Brooks was laughing. Vanessa was smiling, and neither woman seemed aware that I was watching. I remained where I was, hidden behind the office window, observing. For years, I had watched my daughter perform kindness when it benefited her image. This was different. Nobody important was watching. Nobody was taking photographs. Nobody was posting on social media. It was simply one person helping another. Exactly the kind of thing she used to do when she was young. Thomas noticed my expression. "You see it too," I nodded. "Yes." He smiled. "She's been coming here almost every day." That surprised me. Every day. For weeks. I looked back toward the lobby. Vanessa was now helping another resident, an elderly veteran named George Patterson, a man who rarely accepted assistance from anyone. Yet there he stood, happily chatting with her. Something inside me softened. Not because she was earning forgiveness, because she was becoming herself again. Over the following months, the transformation continued. Slowly, authentically, without fanfare. Vanessa began volunteering throughout the building. She helped residents complete paperwork, organized transportation for medical appointments, delivered meals, visited lonely tenants. Sometimes she brought Emily. Sometimes she came alone, but she always showed up. And that's what impressed me most. Consistency. Real change isn't measured in days. It's measured in habits. One afternoon, Emily and I sat together in the courtyard, watching Vanessa coordinate a small community event. Children played nearby. Residents laughed together. Music drifted through the air. The building felt alive. Emily leaned against me. "She's different," I smiled. "She is. You knew she'd change, didn't you?" I thought about the question, then shook my head. "No." Emily looked surprised. "You didn't know." The truth mattered. I hoped. Hope. That's all parents really have sometimes. Hope that lessons stick. Hope that mistakes become wisdom. Hope that love eventually finds its way through. Emily watched her mother for a few more moments, then quietly said, "I'm proud of her." My eyes filled with tears, because that sentence meant more than Emily realized. For months, she'd watched her parents struggle. She'd watched our family fracture. She'd carried worries no teenager should carry. And now she was witnessing healing. Real healing. Not perfection. Not a fairy tale. Something far better. Growth. A few weeks later, Vanessa asked if we could have dinner together. Just the two of us. We met at a small neighborhood restaurant. Nothing fancy. Nothing designed to impress, which felt symbolic. Over dessert, she finally asked the question I knew was coming. "Mom." "Yes." "Will we lose the house?" I looked at her carefully. Months earlier, she would have asked a different question. "Can you save the house?" Now she was asking something deeper. Facing reality. Accepting responsibility. I appreciated that. "The situation is improving?" She nodded. "We've sold the lake house. Good. The second car? Also good. And a lot of other things." I smiled gently. "How does that feel?" She laughed. A real laugh. The kind I hadn't heard in years. Honestly. Liberating. I couldn't help smiling. Because I understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes, possessions own people more than people own possessions. Vanessa continued. "I spent years trying to look successful." I listened quietly. And I never realized how exhausting it was. The honesty warmed my heart. Not because she was suffering, because she was learning. There is a difference, a very important difference. A month later, I invited Vanessa, Brandon, Emily, Michael Reynolds, Thomas Bennett, and several longtime residents to a special gathering in the community hall. Nobody knew exactly why. Only that I had something important to announce. As the room filled, I felt strangely emotional. Richard should have been there. He would have loved this moment. Not because of the success, because of the people, the relationships, the community, everything he valued most. Eventually, I stepped to the front of the room. The conversations quieted. Everyone turned toward me. I took a deep breath. Then began, many years ago, my husband Richard and I bought this building. Smiles appeared throughout the room. Many residents knew the story now. But this building was never our greatest achievement. I looked around carefully. At friends, neighbors, family, people whose lives had become intertwined with ours. Our greatest achievement was the community inside it. Several people nodded. I continued. Richard believed that wealth should serve people. My voice caught slightly. Even now, speaking his name carried emotion. Heavily. He believed success meant helping others climb, not standing above them. Then I looked directly at Vanessa. And he believed people deserved second chances. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Mine too. I reached into my folder and removed a document. This building will now become home to the Richard Hudson Foundation. The room grew silent. Curious, attentive, I smiled. The foundation's purpose will be simple. I paused, then continued. To provide housing assistance, emergency support, and educational resources for older women facing financial hardship, abandonment, or isolation. Several residents gasped softly. Others began applauding. The emotion in the room became overwhelming. For years, Richard and I had discussed creating something like this. A way to give back. A way to transform success into service. Now it was finally happening. Then I made the second announcement. The one that mattered even more. The foundation will have a new director. Vanessa looked confused. So did everyone else. I smiled toward my daughter. Vanessa Carter. The room erupted. Applause, cheers, surprised laughter. Vanessa looked completely stunned. She stood abruptly. What? Tears streamed down her face. I walked toward her. Not because you're my daughter. More tears. Because you've earned the opportunity for several seconds. She couldn't speak. Then she hugged me, tightly. The way she had when she was little. The way she hadn't in years. And in that moment, everything else disappeared. The money, the building, the penthouse, the embarrassment, the conflict. None of it mattered. What mattered was family. What mattered was growth. What mattered was the simple fact that love had survived. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I returned to my apartment. The same apartment Vanessa once mocked. The same apartment she once called a shoebox. The same apartment that contained more wealth than any penthouse ever could. I sat beside the window. The city lights sparkled below. Richard's photograph rested nearby. I picked it up and smiled. We did okay. For a moment, I imagined him smiling back, not because our daughter became successful, not because we built wealth, but because she finally remembered who she was. And perhaps that was the greatest inheritance Richard and I could ever leave behind. Not money, not property, not buildings, values, kindness, humility, love. The things that remain long after everything else is gone. And for the first time in many years, I knew our family was going to be all right. Sometimes the greatest poverty isn't a lack of money, it is a lack of perspective. For years, Vanessa believed success could be measured by homes, cars, titles, and appearances. She spent so much energy trying to prove her worth to the world that she slowly lost sight of the values that truly mattered. Many of us fall into the same trap. We compare ourselves to others, chase approval, and convince ourselves that happiness is waiting behind the next achievement. But life has a way of teaching us what really matters. Pamela's greatest gift was never the building she owned. It was her patience, her grace, her willingness to love even when she was hurt. She understood something many people learn too late: money can provide comfort. But character creates peace. Real wealth is found in relationships. Real success is found in kindness. Real legacy is found in the lives we touch. We all make mistakes. We all lose our way at times. But no mistake has to define the rest of our story. Growth begins the moment we stop defending our actions and start facing the truth. Healing begins the moment pride steps aside and humility takes its place. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to think about the people who matter most in your life. Have you been valuing them enough? Have you been judging someone based on appearances, or have you been carrying a hurt that needs forgiveness? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story affected you the most? Have you ever experienced a similar situation in your own family? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who may need its message today. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world.